Now, the story I want to tell you today is billed as a journey from the driver's seat to the announcer's booth, and that framing is half right. Bell absolutely had a driving career that is worth 40 minutes of your time on its own. But when you dig into where his life actually went after he parked the race car for the last time, you find something more interesting than a guy who just grabbed a microphone at a drag strip and started calling races. What Bell did instead was something that the official history of drag racing broadcasting tends to overlook almost entirely. And when you understand what it was and why he did it and what it preserved, you end up with a story about one man's relationship with an entire sport that spans 6 decades and touches basically every era of doorslammer racing that mattered. So let's start at the beginning. Walter C. Bell was born on February 2, 1942 in Endicott, New York, which is a small city in the southern tier of the state part of what they used to call the Triple Cities region along the Susquehanna River. His parents, Harold and Edith Bell, ran Bell's fruit stand in nearby Owego, which is where Wally grew up, and where he went to Owego Free Academy High School, graduating in 1960. For a brief period after that, he studied music. If you're surprised by that detail, you're not alone, but it turns out the guy had range in more ways than one, and the music thing will actually matter later in the story when we get to what he did with a microphone. By the early 1960s, though, the cars had already taken over. And you have to understand what the timing of that meant, because Wally Bell came of age as a car guy at the exact moment when the American automobile industry decided to start building race cars disguised as street cars and shipping them to drag strips through dealer networks and calling it product development. And if you were a young guy in upstate New York in 1962 and 1963 and you had any interest in going fast, this was the most interesting moment in automotive history that had ever happened and probably ever would happen. The factory wars is what people call this period, and the name fits perfectly. General Motors and Ford and Chrysler had all figured out simultaneously that winning drag races was an extremely cost-effective form of advertising to young car buyers, and so they started building limited production streetcars that were really race cars wearing license plates and handing them to drivers and saying, "Go win us some trophies." The number of these cars they actually built was tiny. We're talking sometimes 50 units, sometimes 100, sometimes even fewer, and they were never sold to the general public. In any normal sense, they were distributed to racers through dealer networks, and the whole thing had a barely controlled chaos quality to it that makes it kind of thrilling to read about today. Chevrolet's entry into this arms race was called the Z11 package, and it was built around the 1963 Impala. What made the Z11 special was the engine. Chevrolet put a 427 cubic inch version of their mystery motor under the hood, and the critical detail is that they cast the intake manifold header tank and front cover out of aluminum to save weight up front, and they also replaced the hood, the bumpers, and the front fenders with aluminum and fiberglass pieces for the same reason. The car was purpose-built for the drag strip in a way that no Chevrolet had ever been before, and Chevrolet built approximately 57 of them total. Not 5,700. Not 570. 57. Wally Bell got one of them. His car ran in A/modified production class, which was one of the more competitive class designations for factory-type cars at the time, and he named it the New York Shaker, which is a passisa callback you need to understand to appreciate fully. Hubert Platt, down in Georgia, had been running a similar car called the Georgia Shaker, and that branding had gotten some attention, and Bell's car actually briefly served as Platt's car at one point before Bell got it going under his own name in the Northeast. So right out of the gate, this Z11 Impala had history attached to it, and Bell raced it all through the mid-1960s, at tracks from upstate New York down through the mid-Atlantic states, and as far south as Piedmont Dragway in North Carolina during what was a golden era for match racing and regional competition. Now, the way Bell got into this car is not fully documented in the sources I could find. What is documented is that he had dealership sponsorships by this point, which means he was already good enough to attract commercial backing, and dealership backing in 1963 almost always meant some kind of connection to the factory pipeline, because that's how cars like the Z11 moved from the General Motors assembly line to someone's trailer. He was 21 years old, running one of only 57 factory race cars Chevrolet had built. Whatever he did to earn that opportunity, he clearly made the most of it. The Northeast in this era had a vibrant regional drag racing circuit. You've got tracks like New England Dragway and Lebanon Valley in New York and Atco in New Jersey, and a string of mid-Atlantic strips that ran active schedules all summer. And guys like Bell were out there every weekend either chasing class points or taking match race money depending on which made more sense that particular week. Match racing was a significant income source for competitive drivers in this period. A promoter would advertise two well-known cars going head-to-head, pay both drivers appearance fees and gate money, and the crowd would show up specifically to see that contest, and both drivers were happy because they got paid whether they won or lost. Bell ran the New York Shaker in this world for the better part of 3 seasons. Then he stopped. The reason is pretty simple and very human. His daughter Vicky was born, and the economics and logistics of running a legitimate race car while starting a family did not add up the way he needed them to. And Bell made the call that any reasonable person in that situation makes. He stepped away. The car that we know ended up stripped and scrapped in an Iowa junkyard, eventually, though a tribute replica was built later to honor its history. Bell went to work in the life insurance industry where, by all accounts, he was good at it and kept climbing until he had built a solid career. He didn't stop thinking about drag racing. He probably never stopped thinking about drag racing. But for a period of time in the late 1960s and through the 1970s, the racing had to wait. What he came back to was a completely different world. And that's the part of the Wally Bell story that doesn't get told enough, because it's not just the story of a guy returning to his hobby after a break. It's the story of a guy who came back and found himself at the exact ground floor of a new discipline that would eventually become one of the most spectacular classes in the sport. By the early 1980s, Bell had relocated to the Carolinas, and he connected with a man named Walter Henry, and together they formed the Denver Fever Racing Team based out of Mooresville, North Carolina. Now, if you're a NASCAR fan, that town name will ring a bell because Mooresville eventually became the beating heart of NASCAR's technical infrastructure. And you could argue some of that energy was already there in the early 1980s, pulling car people into the area. Bell drove a lightweight 1966 Chevelle, while Henry campaigned a Corvette, and they ran the Super Chevy show circuit, which at that point was one of the premier venues for Doorslammer competition in the country. And then Walter Henry was killed in a racing accident. There's no good way to present that other than to just say it. Bell lost his partner and his friend to the sport they'd both committed to, and that is a weight that doesn't go away. Bell pressed forward anyway. You can read a lot into that choice and not be wrong about any of it. Maybe he felt Henry would have wanted him to keep racing. Maybe racing was the thing that helped him process the loss. Maybe after nearly 2 decades away from the sport, he simply was not going to give it up again for anything. Whatever the reason, Bell kept going, and what came next turned out to be the most significant chapter of his driving career. Right around this period in the mid-1980s, something was happening at Super Chevy events and at certain match races and regional shows that hadn't been given a name yet, but you could see it if you knew where to look. A group of Doorslammer racers had started pushing elapsed times into territory that nobody had mapped out for street-bodied cars running blown engines. These weren't top fuel cars. These weren't funny cars. These were Camaros and Chevelles and Corvettes with bodies that looked like something you could theoretically drive to the store, and power plants that absolutely would kill you if you thought about them sideways, and a level of technical ambition that had simply outgrown whatever class structure existed to contain them. The guys in this group would eventually be known as pro-modified pioneers. The class they were effectively inventing, without calling it that, would formalize later through the NHRA and ADRL and various other sanctioning bodies, and today, Pro-Mod is one of the most watched Doorslammer disciplines anywhere in the world, with cars regularly running in the 3-second range on nitrous or turbochargers or blowers. But in the mid-1980s, none of that existed yet. There was just a collection of extremely fast Doorslammer cars that didn't fit neatly into existing class structures, and a group of drivers who were all trying to run quicker than anyone had ever run in a car that looked like a car. Wally Bell was squarely in that group. He progressed through 3 primary cars during this era, And the progression tells you everything about the trajectory of what he and his contemporaries were building. His 1966 Chevelle ran a best of 7.91 seconds, which sounds pedestrian now, but in the context of street-bodied cars in the mid-1980s, was legitimately fast. He moved from there to a Beretta that he dialed down to 7.31, which was getting into territory where you really started to pay attention. Then he built the car that defined his reputation in this world, which was a 1969 Camaro that eventually ran 7.16 seconds at 189 miles per hour. Think about what those numbers represent in a car that has a full interior and a roof and door glass and recognizable body panels. The quarter-mile time is in a range where modern turbo motorcycles compete. The trap speed is close to what top fuel cars were running in the late 1960s. And Bell was doing it in something that at least had the shape of a production car, which created a visual drama that open-wheel fuel cars simply couldn't match. Because when you watch a funny car or a pro mod make a full-power run, you can relate to the machine in a way you can't when the car is a tube-frame slingshot. It looks like a real car doing something impossible, and audiences responded to that in a way that explained exactly why the class took off the way it eventually did. The group Bell ran with at this level had names that any serious Super Chevy follower from that era will recognize immediately. Charles Carpenter was running his famous 1955 Chevrolet shoebox that had become one of the most crowd-pleasing cars on the circuit. Rob Vandergriff was out there, Gordy Faust, Norm Wisner. These guys collectively got referred to as the world's fastest club, which is not a formal organization, but more of a shorthand for the tier of competition they'd all reached. And the combination of talent and ambition and sometimes luck that had put them all in the same performance bracket at the same moment in history. Bell's sponsors during this period were Carl Chevrolet and Harmons, and throughout all of it, his crew consisted primarily of his wife, Beverly, who has to be mentioned here because every single account of Bell's career treats her not as supporting cast, but as a genuine partner in the operation. They had been together for their full 39-year marriage by the time Bell retired, and Beverly was at the track every weekend working the car, and that's not a small thing to acknowledge. Running a competitive Super Chevy Doorslammer is not a one-person operation. The tuning the tire changes the logistics, the travel, the mechanical preparation. All of it takes a team. And for most of Bell's later career, that team was essentially the two of them. His friendship with Charles Carpenter during this era went deeper than just being competitors. They were close enough that Bell and Beverly became godparents to Carpenter's daughter Katie, and when Carpenter eulogized Bell in 2022, he said something that might be the most accurate thing anyone ever said about him. He said Wally was the friendliest person you ever met at the track, but if he lined up beside you, he was as tough a competitor as there was. That combination of genuine warmth off the staging lanes and absolute competitive focus once the tree lit up is the kind of quality that gets you remembered, and in Bell's case, it defined how the entire community understood him for nearly 4 decades. By the 1990s, the Super Chevy circuit and the Doorslammer scene in the South and Southeast had evolved into something more organized, and Bell evolved with it, running nostalgia events and Super Chevy shows, and Bill Blair's Nostalgia Days events at Farmington Dragway, which had become one of the premier venues for this kind of racing in the region. His 7.16 Camaro represented what he could do at the height of his competitive career. And somewhere in the late 1990s, the math started to shift the way it eventually shifts for everyone who's been doing this long enough. You're not as quick as you were. The car needs more than you can put into it. The weekends are harder. The logistics are more expensive relative to what you're getting back. Bell retired from active competition in 2001. That single-year number carries a lot of weight because it means he started in 1963 with the Z11 New York Shaker, and he ran continuously for 38 consecutive seasons, which is a number that almost doesn't make sense until you sit with it for a moment. 38 years of loading up a race car and driving to a drag strip and doing it for real at whatever the highest level of competition he could access in a given era. Not as a hobbyist, not as a once-in-a-while thing, as a serious competitive racer with sponsorship and crew and a legitimate program year after year for nearly 4 decades. That career alone justifies this documentary. But it's what happened next that makes the story unusual. The recognition came first. In 2007, Bell was inducted into the Legion of Honor through the National Nostalgia Drag Racing Association, which is one of the more meaningful acknowledgments you can receive in the nostalgia racing community because the NNDRA focuses specifically on honoring the history and the people who built that history rather than current performance. In 2007, he was also honored at a 25th anniversary reunion put together by Frank Spittle that brought together figures like Arnie Beswick and Lamar Walden and Charles Carpenter and Floyd Garrett and Randy DeLizio alongside Bell, and that event was essentially a celebration of the generation of racers who had made the Doorslammer class what it became. In 2008, he went into the East Coast Drag Racing Hall of Fame. By the end of his life, he'd reportedly been inducted into 5 Halls of Fame total, though I could only independently verify those 2 specific ones. Also in 2008, Bell connected with the Casella racing team in an advisory and tuning capacity which kept him physically involved with competitive racing even in retirement, and that connection matters because it meant he never fully left the pits. He was still there, still talking engines and setups and clutch packs with people who were actively racing, still relevant to the technical conversation. But the thing that happened around 2010 is what puts Wally Bell in a category that almost nobody else occupies in drag racing history, and it requires a little bit of context about where drag racing media was at that particular moment to understand why it matters. Here's something worth thinking about. By 2010, the NHRA had been on ESPN for nearly a decade, and that coverage had professionalized the broadcast side of the sport enormously in terms of production values and national reach. But it had also narrowed the focus considerably. You watched the ESPN broadcast, and you saw Top Fuel and Funny Car and Pro Stock. You heard about Schumacher and Force and Bernstein, and later Greg Anderson and Jason Line. You got professional studio presentation and color commentary from guys like Mike Dunn, who'd been a successful competitor himself, and later Tony Pedregon, who took over when the sport moved to Fox. What you didn't get anywhere on television or mainstream radio was the grassroots Doorslammer history. The guys who'd run blower cars on the Super Chevy circuit in 1986 and helped invent Pro Modified before Pro Modified was an official thing. The nostalgia racers. The super stock legends. The match racers from the 1960s and 1970s who had built the entire foundation that the ESPN-era NHRA was standing on. That knowledge lived in people's heads and in faded magazine clippings and in photographs that were slowly deteriorating in shoeboxes and garages all over the country, and nobody was doing anything systematic to capture it. Jeff Gilder had started a website called Racers Reunion that was explicitly built around connecting the old guard with each other and with fans who wanted to engage with that history. And Gilder had also gotten into internet radio through what he called the Zeus Radio Network. And he approached Bell about hosting a show on that platform, and Bell said yes. And around April of 2010, the Wally Bell Show went on the air. The format was live call-in radio on Wednesday evenings at 7 p.m. Eastern on a toll-free number and streaming internationally over the internet, and the whole thing had the feel of calling into a friend who happened to know everyone who'd ever gone fast in a Doorslammer car. Bell brought in guests every week from the community he'd spent 4 decades building relationships inside, and the roster of people who came on that show reads like a comprehensive oral history of a particular golden era of drag racing. Charles Carpenter was an early guest, Dale Creasy Jr., who would go on to win in Nitro Funny Car, Quayne Stott, who was a pro-mod standout, Gentleman Joe Schubeck, who not only raced fuel cars, but founded Lakewood Industries, which made the Bell housing safety blankets that literally kept drivers alive. Tommy Johnson, Sr., Bob Harrop, who won the 1965 York, Pennsylvania Superstock Nationals, Carolyn Melendi, who was known as the First Lady of Pro Mod, George Schreiber, who ran as the Bushmaster, Bob Mayerly, who drove the Peppermint Twist car, Carl Moyer, Sam Mamello, the list keeps going. He also did tribute episodes dedicated to legends who'd passed, Dave Strickler episodes, Ronnie Sox episodes, oral history work that captured stories and perspectives that exist nowhere in any formal archive because nobody ever wrote them down, and the people who lived through those moments were in their 60s and 70s, and the window to get those stories was closing. Now here's what's interesting about the framing of Wally Bell as someone who went from the driver's seat to the announcer's booth. The booth thing is real in spirit but wrong in specifics. Bell was never an NHRA track announcer. He never called races over a PA system at a national event. He was never on ESPN or Fox Sports as a color commentator. He didn't follow the path that someone like Mike Dunn followed, where you compete at the top level and then transition into professional broadcast media. That comparison would actually undersell what Bell was doing, because what he was doing was more personal and more community-specific, and in some ways more valuable to the preservation of drag racing history than any amount of national television commentary would have been. The announcer's booth comparison brings to mind guys like Dave McClelland, who started announcing drag races in 1959 and became the on-camera host of NHRA television coverage in 1973, and whose voice became so synonymous with the sport that when he passed away in May of 2022, the entire community felt it. Or Bernie Partridge, who was NHRA's chief announcer starting in 1958, and is actually the person who gave Don Garlits the nickname Big Daddy, which is a fact so significant it almost needs its own documentary. Or Bob Frey, who served as NHRA's lead track announcer for 46 years before retiring at the 2012 Pomona finale. These men built the broadcast identity of the NHRA from the ground up, and their work defined how millions of fans experienced the sport on television and at events. Bell operated in a completely different lane from all of them. Not a lesser lane, a different one. What Bell did with his show was fill a gap that the official broadcast apparatus of the sport was never going to fill, because the official broadcast apparatus had ratings to chase, and advertisers to satisfy, and national audiences to maintain. Bell had Wednesday nights at 7 p.m. and a phone number, and a platform that was built specifically for the people who remembered the 1966 Chevelle class at the Super Chevy series, and could tell you exactly who ran what and how the tune-up worked and what the track conditions were like and why so-and-so got beat in the third round, even though his car had been quicker all weekend. That level of specificity and that depth of community knowledge is exactly what internet radio could carry in a way that network television never could. The show ran for roughly 5 years, from around 2010 to 2015, and during that time it built a dedicated listener base that was enthusiastic enough that in 2012, Competition Plus nominated the Wally Bell Show for the .com Awards Internet Radio Show of the year, and the Racers Reunion community organized an active campaign to drive votes because they believed the show was doing something genuinely important, and they were right. The nomination didn't come from nowhere. It came from people who recognized that the show was doing preservation work that nobody else was doing in quite the same way. Bell described his own philosophy for the show as positive and upbeat, with past, current, and future discussed every week. And when you read accounts of how he ran it, that description checks out, because Bell by all accounts approached the hosting role the same way he'd approached the racing itself. With full engagement and without any sense that he was doing you a favor by showing up. He was there because he wanted to be there, and he made his guests feel the same way, and the conversations that came out of that atmosphere were the kind you can't manufacture with a producer and a format and a scripted list of questions. There's a detail about Bell's background that I keep coming back to, and it's that brief period after high school when he studied music before the cars took over completely. I don't want to overread it, but there's something there worth considering. Music and announcing both involve timing and rhythm and an intuitive sense of when to let something breathe and when to push. And those are exactly the qualities that make someone compelling on a microphone. Bell clearly had some of that instinct before he ever sat in a race car, and 38 years of competing gave him the credibility and the relationships and the storytelling material to put behind it. The music interlude might have been a detour, but it was probably not irrelevant. What Bell brought to that microphone that no professional broadcaster could have matched was the credibility of someone who'd been in the staging lanes with all of these people. When Charles Carpenter came on the show and started talking about what it felt like to dial in a blown big block for a 7-second run on a cool fall morning, Bell didn't just nod along. He'd done that. He knew what Carpenter was describing from the inside. He could ask the follow-up question that only makes sense if you've actually managed a race car at that level. And the guests could feel that too, which is why the conversations on the Wally Bell Show have a texture and a depth that's genuinely different from what you get when a professional broadcast host interviews a racer. The grassroots internet radio space that Bell helped pioneer in the late 2000s and early 2010s was a legitimate media ecosystem that doesn't get enough credit in the history of how drag racing managed to stay culturally relevant during a period when the official broadcast product was struggling with tape-delayed coverage and shrinking budgets. Alongside the Wally Bell Show, you had Joe Castello's WFO Radio and the Wes Buck Show out of Drag Illustrated, and a growing collection of podcasts and streaming shows that were doing things the NHRA television package couldn't do. They were going long form. They were going deep into history. They were giving listeners access to personalities and stories that would never make the network broadcast cut. Bell was among the first wave of people doing this in the drag racing space, and he was doing it with a level of institutional knowledge that almost nobody else possessed. The years after the show wound down, Bell stayed connected to the nostalgia racing community the way he always had. He showed up at events. He stayed in touch with old friends. He remained a presence on social media through his Wally Bell Drag Racer Facebook page, which documented his career and kept connections alive with the community that had followed him since the Doorslammer days. In 2014, he was listed among the legends at a nostalgia event in York, Pennsylvania that people called the Woodstock of drag racing, alongside Wally Booth and Arnie Beswick and Linda Vaughn and Butch Liel and Bruce Larson. And that's a guest list that tells you exactly what tier of drag racing history Wally Bell occupied in the community's understanding of its own past. His wife Beverly was with him through all of it, 39 years of marriage that encompassed the whole arc from the Super Chevy circuit to the internet radio studio to the nostalgia events and every step in between. When Beverly announced her husband's death in June of 2022, she wrote that the world had lost a most amazing human being and that he was her best friend and her rock. And that description of a partnership that had lasted through racing careers and tragedy and career changes and 4 decades of life together is probably the most important thing you can know about who Wally Bell was as a person. June 13th, 2022, that's when Bell died. He was 80 years old and the death was sudden, and the community reacted the way communities react when they lose someone who has been genuinely central to their shared experience for longer than most of them can clearly remember. Drag Illustrated ran an immediate death announcement the next day and then came back with a full biographical tribute by Greg Burrow in issue 177 in August 2022. Funeral services were held July 15th at Covenant Funeral Service in Fredericksburg, Virginia, with a celebration of life at the Kingdom Family Center. There's one more detail here that gives the timing a particular weight. Dave McClelland had died 3 weeks earlier on May 22, 2022. McClelland was the voice of NHRA television coverage. Bell was the voice of grassroots Doorslammer oral history on the internet. 2 men who had found completely different ways to serve drag racing's relationship with its own story, gone within a month of each other. That parallel is not a coincidence or a contrivance. It's just one of those things that happens in any community's history, where the people who shaped its understanding of itself tend to arrive and depart in clusters because they live through the same eras and face the same physics. So step back and look at the full arc of what Wally Bell's life in drag racing actually was. He started with one of the rarest factory drag cars Chevrolet ever produced, in a class that barely existed yet, at a moment when the American auto industry was just figuring out how to weaponize horsepower for marketing purposes. He ran that car with enough success to attract dealership backing in his early 20s, which in that era was real validation. He stepped away when life required it, not with bitterness, but with the practical understanding that a young family and a race car don't always add up, and he built a successful career in a completely different field. He came back. He lost a partner to the sport and kept going anyway. He helped invent a class that now runs at every major sanctioned event in the country. He ran 7.16 at 189 miles per hour in a car with doors and a roof. He did all of this for 38 straight seasons without a gap year. And then when it was done, he picked up a microphone and started calling the people he'd raced with and against for 4 decades. And he said, "Let's talk about what we built and let's get it on tape before it disappears." And the people he called showed up every Wednesday evening for 5 years because they trusted him and because he asked good questions and because the conversations they had on that show preserved corners of drag racing history that would otherwise exist only in the fading memories of people who were there. That's not a conventional story about someone going from the driver's seat to the announcer's booth. The conventional story would be cleaner and more familiar. Former racer becomes TV commentator, gets a headset, calls the Christmas tree. We've all seen that version. Bell's version is messier and more grassroots and more human, and I'd argue it's more interesting because it shows you what happens when someone with deep institutional knowledge and genuine personal relationships and no corporate broadcast infrastructure to answer to decides to document the history of the thing he loves before the people who lived it are gone. He got into the world's fastest club through talent and determination and a willingness to keep pushing when the smart move might have been to stop. He got into the East Coast Drag Racing Hall of Fame and the Legion of Honor and reportedly 4 other halls of fame through the same qualities applied over decades. He got on the air through a combination of the right platform appearing at the right moment and the kind of personal credibility that you can only build by actually being there. The thing about Wally Bell that keeps coming back around in everything written about him and in everything his contemporaries said when he died is that the warmth was real. It wasn't a broadcast personality. It wasn't a public face he put on for the fans. Charles Carpenter said it best: friendliest person you ever met at the track. But if he lined up beside you, he was as tough a competitor as there was. That combination of genuine personal warmth and fierce competitive focus is rare enough in any context, and almost vanishingly rare in someone who maintains it consistently across 4 decades of high-level racing. The New York Shaker Z11 ended up in a junkyard in Iowa. That particular piece of history didn't survive. The oral history that Bell spent 5 years preserving on a Wednesday evening internet radio show for the racers' reunion community came out of a home studio and aired over a toll-free phone line, and probably doesn't have the best production quality in the world, but it exists. The conversations he had with Charles Carpenter and gentleman Joe Schubeck and Carolyn Melendi and Tommy Johnson Sr. and Bob Harrop and George Schreiber and everyone else who sat down to talk about what they'd built in the Doorslammer class. Before the Doorslammer class had a name exist because Wally Bell asked the right questions at the right time. That's the story. From the starting line to the airwaves. 38 seasons driving and then a microphone pointed at the people who'd been there alongside him the whole time. Not glamorous, not nationally televised, not the kind of legacy that comes with a trophy or a primetime broadcast slot. Just a man who loved drag racing completely and spent the last chapter of his life making sure the part of its history that he'd personally witnessed didn't get lost. He died on a Monday morning in June of 2022. His wife Beverly said the world had lost a most amazing human being. She was right, and so had drag racing.